Believe it or not, Netflix has some incredible movies right now, and some of the best ones can be pretty hard to find. This list of 10 hidden gems on Netflix includes a couple of really great thrillers, a couple of action-packed flicks, and 2 documentaries that are just absolutely mind-blowing. Thanks to Sundays for Dogs for sponsoring this video. We'll talk more about them in a bit, but first, my number 10 pick. A brand new action release from South Korea titled Mission Cross that is surprisingly lighthearted. Now don't get me wrong, there's plenty of violence in this movie, but it comes across as kind of a PG-13 thing, and a bit of a comedy too, like I said, lighthearted. Don't go into this expecting a full-out comedy, you're gonna be disappointed, and don't go into it expecting a balls-to-the-wall action movie. In fact, this movie has quite a lot in common with Mr. and Mrs. Smith. You follow a husband and wife, she is like an elite detective, and he's kind of a dopey house husband, but he's got a secret up his sleeve, and this ends up being a really cool spy flick that never takes itself too seriously, and it doesn't get nearly as dark as a lot of the other movies from South Korea I tend to recommend here on the channel, meaning it's kind of a breath of fresh air, and it was just recently added to Netflix as a Netflix original here in the US. Next up, I've got an action movie that is a new release. It just came out here in 2024. Like a lot of movies released in 2024, it bombed at the box office and is already available on Netflix. Doesn't mean it's not a good watch.
This is not the conversation we should be having right now.
In the Land of Bad, you follow Liam Hemsworth and a crew of commandos. He's actually a really fantastic actor. I've liked him in a handful of movies and think he's fairly underrated. But in this movie, he gets trapped behind enemy lines. Russell Crowe plays like the man in the chair. He's actually operating drones at certain points in the movie. And they're essentially just trying to get their like last man standing back out of this enemy territory. That's it. And the movie's got a great look to it. They're in this like jungle setting. This is not one that's just so solid it's gonna stand up for decades. It's not one people will be watching years from now, but if you generally like this genre, I can tell you that The Land of Bad is a pretty decent entry for 2024 that again was unfortunately overlooked.
You gotta move, man.
Get up and go!
My number 8 pick is kind of a weird art house film that actually comes from director Nicholas Winding Refn, who's most famous for the movie Drive with Ryan Gosling. Just before Drive, he directed Valhalla Rising with Mads Mikkelsen. Now this is an excellent and epic Viking movie. I say epic, they go on an epic journey, but the production is fairly small. Now, I do need to state that this movie gets very strange in its final act, something that Nicholas Winding Refn is kind of known for, meaning this movie is not nearly as accessible as Drive, but if you've liked some of his weirder movies like The Neon Demon, and you've got any interest in watching a Viking epic, I can tell you Valhalla Rising definitely delivers, but if you find art house films to be a little bit too weird for your taste at times, Valhalla Rising is gonna be. Next up, I've got a throwback thriller with a hell of a cast, including Meryl Streep, Kevin Bacon, the kid from Jurassic Park, and John C. Reilly in The River Wild. Now, there is another movie on Netflix titled River Wild. It follows a somewhat similar plot, but here I'm recommending the Meryl Streep version from the 90s. She plays a very experienced river guide taking her family out for this long trip where they run into a couple of fellows who seem like nice guys, played by Kevin Bacon and John C. Reilly. Obviously, they're not very nice guys, and this ends up just being a real tense thriller with a bunch of great moments that has held up. This movie's 30 years old, and I still strongly recommend it. Now, for any dog lovers that are watching, you're gonna wanna pay close attention to this next bit, and then we'll get to the rest of the movies. Today's sponsor, Sundays for Dogs, actually extended the life of our dog, Peanut. As she got older, we noticed she stopped digesting the food that we were giving her forever, food that we thought was nice premium food, and her little tiny frame was just withering away right in front of us, and then I switched her to Sundays. Sundays is actually air-dried dog food that is shelf-stable, meaning there's no messy prep or cleanup, but more importantly, Sundays is 90% human-grade meat. That means meat that's safe for you and I to eat. The other 10% is vegetables with 0 synthetic ingredients. If you've ever used other fresh dog food brands, you know that they can make quite a mess. They do spoil fairly quickly and easily, and you have none of that to deal with Sundays. It's basically like dried kibble that you just drop in the bowl and they gobble it up. And because it's shelf stable, Sundays is not spending extra money on refrigeration costs, ice packs to get it to you. In fact, Sundays can cost 40% less than other fresh dog food brands, but for a limited time, my viewers can save 50% off their first order with Sundays on top of that already great price. All you gotta do is go to the link in the video description down below or just type in sundaysfordogs.com/flick. Again, that's 50% off, an already great deal, and you know that you'll be giving your dog better nutrition than typical grocery store food. Again, use my link in the video description or just go to sundaysfordogs.com/flick to get that great discount. But speaking of great stuff, let's talk about the remaining movies on this list. If you want to go on a wild ride, something that actually happened where the filmmakers are like in the hot seat, they're literally running with the devil in Running with the Devil.
Oh, hello there. I'm John McAfee, founder of the McAfee Antivirus Company.
This is the story of the final days of software pioneer John McAfee, or rather, the last few months of his life, which is a wild story. There's a good chance you heard some of it on the news. This guy was actually running for president during all of this chaos at the end of his life. He spends most of that time on the run. He's accused of murder that he likely committed. This documentary shows all of that, but what makes this so good and why it's ranked so high on this list of killer flicks is he invited some filmmakers to come with him, and they got insane footage of this guy literally on the run from law enforcement from multiple countries. And I mean, the guy is an absolute basket case, and the story that they unfold throughout this documentary feels like it shouldn't actually be real. I mean, if it were a movie, I would not recommend it because it would be so far-fetched, it would make no sense, it would be a terrible movie. If you like true crime, I highly recommend this, but even if you're just kind of like me and you have kind of an affinity for wild folks, you've got to see Running with the Devil. My number 5 pick on this list is a World War II spy movie with an incredible cast, including Paul Giamatti, Guy Pearce, Sienna Miller, Mark Strong, and Paul Rudd in The Catcher Was a Spy. Now, this is based on the true story of a Major League Baseball player named Mo Berg, who was recruited by the US military to become a spy for a very high-level mission. I don't want to give away quite what it was in this review, but if you tend to enjoy World War II movies, more particularly espionage flicks, this is an excellent one. It does suffer a bit from like a made-for-TV quality, not in a terrible way, it's just not particularly cinematic, but you still get a bunch of great characters from all those actors I mentioned. Paul Rudd is fantastic, and more importantly, the true story is almost unbelievable. This is a great flick for anyone who loves movies from this era, and it's one that largely went unnoticed, and I'm not quite sure why, because other than that made-for-TV quality I mentioned, it's fairly excellent. Alright, my number 4 pick is a truly epic movie from India, but before telling you about the movie, I should mention how movies from India operate on streaming services, because they're a bit different. If you don't know, in India they have a bunch of different languages, and most movies that come out of India are dubbed in all of those different languages. Oftentimes, if I'm watching a movie from India, unfortunately, I get stuck watching a dubbed version that's dubbed in another language from India, which means it's dubbed and I'm reading subtitles. Sometimes these movies from India will have an English version, but it's separate, so you need to look for it. Not the case with my pick here though, Maharaja, that got outrageously good reviews in India. For someone who watches a lot of movies from South Korea, I was constantly reminded of some of my favorites from South Korea while watching Maharaja. Now, this is not an action-packed flick. When there is action, it is quite brutal and really well done, but the story here takes precedence over any sort of action. In fact, if you go into this expecting an action movie, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But it is an excellent drama with plenty of twists and turns. There are some things out of chronological order that surprise you out of nowhere. All of that stuff is well executed, and again, the action is as well, but you're only getting a handful of action sequences in this movie. You are getting motivations I've not seen in an action movie ever, and yes, they're motivations that kind of work culturally for India a bit better than they would here in the US, but that's also what makes this movie interesting, is it's got its own unique flavor, and not just because there's really cool Indian music and the language, obviously, but the flavor I'm talking about actually comes out of a fairly unique story, a surprisingly unique story. I will say though, as brutal as some of the action is in this movie, there is also some brutal violence towards women in this movie. It's kind of a central theme of the movie. It's not pervasive through the whole thing, but it's a catalyst for some of the revenge that takes place in this flick. And for someone, again, who watches not just a lot of movies from South Korea, but a lot of revenge movies, there was something unique about Maharaja. Now, if you generally like those types of movies, I can tell you this one is a real gem. Now, my number 3 pick is a crime movie from the US. It too is a somewhat recent release, but this stars Aubrey Plaza in a surprisingly dramatic role in Emily the Criminal. Here, she plays a woman who's down on her luck. In fact, the way they introduce her character I thought was fantastic in this movie. And her performance is just a total knockout. I've always thought she was really funny and charming, but to see her do a more serious role, she absolutely kills it. And as a woman who's down on her luck, she gets recruited into a credit card scheme. And the movie actually illustrates how some of these schemes work in great detail. That stuff's interesting enough, and then you get wrapped up in all the trouble that she finds herself in. And the way it's directed actually has kind of a raw, realistic feel as well. So it's kind of firing on all cylinders. Her performance is fantastic. The setup, the story, the things that they're showing you are unique, they're real, and they're interesting. And it ultimately ends up being a pretty explosive thriller if you can be patient through the first half. Now, believe it or not, on a list of hidden gems, I've included a Coen Brothers movie, and that's because it's one that just never comes up. Any discussions about their movies, I never hear anyone mention the Hudsucker Proxy. And now this is one that was released between Barton Fink and Fargo. And while it's not quite as good as either of those two movies, it's damn close. I mean, with the exception of The Big Lebowski, I consider this one to be as good as any of their comedy movies. Sam Raimi even co-wrote this with the Coen Brothers, which makes it extra special. But Tim Robbins plays this guy working in a mailroom with dreams of just working his way up to the top, where he's actually plucked out of obscurity and placed as the president of this big company as part of a stock scheme. And Tim Robbins' character is just a total idiot. That's why they pick him, yet he invents a hula hoop. There's all sorts of really colorful, vibrant, fun elements to the Hudsucker Proxy. You've got Paul Newman in there as well, one of his last really great performances, and a bunch of just legendary character actors. I would say if you love Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, this has a lot of similar humor in it, obviously a different vibe and a different era and everything, but still, I highly recommend this for fans of that and other Coen Brothers comedies like Raising Arizona. And then my number 1 pick is a documentary, but it made my number 1 pick for multiple reasons. The biggest one, it's as compelling as any fast-paced sports movie you've ever seen in your life, and you don't need to know or care anything about Formula One to thoroughly enjoy Senna. This doc depicts the life and times of one of the greatest Formula One drivers of all time. In fact, it's not been on Netflix for years, and the reason they've added it back is there is a new series by the same name coming to Netflix soon. And I still remember this documentary unfolding like a real life drama. Now, his life has some drama in it and all that stuff's interesting enough, but the documentary actually follows several of his pivotal races and some of the wild things that happened politically behind the scenes, but also on the track, making Senna easily one of the most high drama documentaries I've ever seen. It's fast-paced, it's exciting, it's compelling, it's everything you would want in a sports documentary. And again, you don't need any affinity for even just cars. You don't need to care about racing to get hooked on this documentary. I personally am looking forward to the series. Hopefully, it's at least half as compelling as this documentary, because I'm telling you, this one is a real gem. And don't forget to go to sundaysfordogs.com/flick to get that discount. But thanks for watching this video, and you will see me on the next one.